Welcome to the Final Girls podcast. I'm Anna Pogutskaya, and as ever, I'm your podcast host. In this mini-series, we're exploring and celebrating The House of Psychotic Women, the seminal book by Kayla Janice.
What do you think? Go ahead, be honest, just tell me. You think I'm insane?
You know these women wrestling in an arena of mud?
No, I disgust you. I sicken you. You hate me.
But it's difficult, don't you understand? It is difficult. I didn't want it to happen, but it happened, and now...
Over the past few episodes of this mini-series, we have been celebrating and interrogating Kayla Janice's book, House of Psychotic Women, which is, at the same time, a book of film criticism, a topography of female neurosis on screen, and a memoir. I've been talking to filmmakers whose films have a psychotic woman at the heart of them, about a film that's featured in a book that has somehow inspired or influenced their own work in some way. I've spoken to Prana Bailey Bond, director of Censor, about Let's Scare Jessica to Death, Deborah Haywood, director of Pincushion, about David Cronenberg's The Brood, Kane Senes and Hannah Barlow, co-directors of Sissy, spoke about Carrie, and this week, in this penultimate episode of the miniseries, I'm talking to Alice Lowe, the writer, director, and star of Prevenge. Alice is working on her new film right now, took the time out of the edit to talk about Heavenly Creatures, the Peter Jackson directed story about an obsessive friendship between two teenage girls with overactive imaginations that culminates in a murder. Based on a true story and starring Melanie Lynskey and Kate Winslet, the film is a true gem of teenage hysteria and folie à deux. If you enjoyed this episode, please do let me know. You can find me, perhaps not for very long, on Twitter at AnnaBeDemented. And if you wish to support the podcast, you can do so over on Patreon at patreon.com/thefinalgirls, or just by taking a few seconds, leaving us a review on Apple or Spotify podcasts. And with all of that said, please join me in the House of Psychotic Women. Before we begin, Alice, I just wanted to say thank you very much for making the time. I know you're editing your new film right now, so I appreciate that you've even made the time this evening to do this for me.
Oh, thanks for having me. Yeah, it's nice to actually talk to a person rather than just sitting in an edit with a lovely editor, I should add. But, you know, most of the time we're just not looking at each other. We're just looking at a screen. But I'm really enjoying it. It's great.
So I wanted to start with a little bit of personal history with you and House of Psychotic Women. What is your relationship with the book? When did you first encounter it?
So I am lucky enough to live near a really lovely gallery that has a lovely bookshop. And whenever I go into this bookshop, it's like a magical bookshop. There always seems to be some magic book that I pick up and go, oh my God, I'm going to turn this into a film, or oh my God, this has changed the way I think about life. And I walked in and there was a book called House of Psychotic Women. And I just was like, that's the book for me. Had never heard of it before, just picked it up, read it, and was so bowled over by it that I was tweeting about it. And a couple of people got in touch and said, oh, I know Kayla. I'll introduce you, you know, which was like meeting a rock star or something. Yeah, and it was just like nothing I'd ever read before. Yeah, and I just think I recommend it to people all the time. I'm kind of like, oh, you need to read this.
And what about the writing itself struck you?
I think it was how personal it is. It's sort of unapologetically about an individual response to films that maybe as a feminist you might feel like you weren't allowed to like, that you enjoyed, but you're not supposed to enjoy them because there's violence towards women in them, or there's depictions of female characters who are unhinged or mad or violent. And it was her personal response to those films, and it sort of felt like, oh, okay, it's okay to be a participant in watching a film. You don't have to listen to someone else's rules about what's wrong or right. You can just have your own unique reaction to it. And the way that she was so sort of open about what her life entailed and what stages she saw different films and how they applied to her own personal story, I just thought was incredible. And it was so sort of, there is this illusion that critics and film critics are impartial and that they don't come from a particular perspective, and it's all nonsense, of course, and I felt like it kind of busts that myth that that critics aren't usually a very small select group of particular type of people, and that it's okay to bring your personal experience to the table, and actually that's the most honest and truthful way to respond to a film. And I think it's sort of helped me in the way that I write films, actually, that I'm sort of unapologetic about how, this is from me and it comes from me. What else could it possibly be as a writer-director? Who else would it have come from? And that it's okay. And it sort of helps you to accept the flaws in your writing and the personal quirks, which to me, I would defend to the death, because I kind of feel like we're entering to this corporatization of art, really, at the moment. I feel it as an actor sometimes, particularly, that I'm like, there's no authorship behind this. This is kind of just a product, that anyone could have churned out. This person can't do it, we replace them immediately. It is very important that this is completely generic in every way and that nothing stands out or is daring or bold or new. It's just got to be a product that keeps people's attention. And it sort of feels like it's sort of dangerous to be an author, because they can't replace you, the weirder the stuff that you do or the more idiosyncratic. You can't be replaced. So you sort of... I just think it's interesting the way that authorship is going in terms of television and independent film, or film specifically, not independent film. I feel like independent film is therefore being sort of crushed slightly.
It is curious that you say that, because we do seem to live in a moment where, and I've spoken about this before, that it's been going on for years, that sort of our screens are collapsing onto one another. Film is TV is film, everything is streaming, everything becomes content. And kind of whether you subscribe to the auteur theory or not, the thing that you're talking about kind of is that personality, the voice and the intent that goes in behind something.
It's like the soul of something, which warts and all, it's kind of like I sort of love watching stuff that's wrong sometimes now. It's like, I think that's the other thing that the book teaches you. Like, you don't have to enjoy a film. You don't have to like it, but you might get something from it. You might get something from a bad film, even if it's like something that surprised you for 30 seconds or something you've never seen before. Those moments they're like a sort of mutant gene in terms of like the evolution of filmmaking, I think, or of art or of TV or whatever. And
also that what's bad... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying those things seem to be getting eliminated by television specifically, I think, and the production, the way that television is produced.
And also the things that are bad are completely determined by who you are and when you watch something. I've had films that I've watched and thought, oh, this is shit. And then I've revisited them and completely changed my perspective on them, and vice versa as well. Like things that I thought were really special because I watched them at a particular time in my life. When I revisited them, I was like, oh, there's really nothing here.
I know. I've done that quite a lot with 90s films, like 90s films that were thought of as critically kind of mediocre. I've rewatched them and gone, this is the best film I've seen this year. Like, what's happened? Like, am I just getting old and I'm just like intolerant of, or if we genuinely lost something in terms of storytelling? There's like, I think there's a real sort of, I don't know. It's just like I've had that as well with films that maybe were aimed at me as a teenager, and I turned my nose up at them. And I've rewatched them now and gone, God, they're brilliant. They're like really like films that are not considered as being great works of art. And I'm like, oh my God, it's the best thing I've seen. It's the best thing. So people are like, has anyone got any recommendations? And I'm like, 10 things I hate about you. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. And people are like,
it is genuinely brilliant.
Like, it is genuinely brilliant.
Yeah.
Like, but the energy to those performances, it's like, you know, I watch something like that and then I get obsessed with like, what was it like to film? And then, you know, when you read, oh, everyone was having a blast doing it. They were having a blast. Of course they were. The energy on the screen is crackling and, you know, fizzing and stuff. And that's what I'm trying to recreate when I'm as a director. When I'm making something, I just want that magic and that electricity on the screen. And some would say you can't manufacture that, but to me, it's like a mixture of sort of being relaxed enough to let the unexpected happen. You know, it's like controlled chaos, you know, and like, that's what I think is not, as an actor, I don't experience that very much these days, where you're genuinely on set going, wow, we're going to get something special here, because there's that special atmosphere that you just don't get on many things. So my sort of whole aim is to create that, but you know, whether that's within your Netflix contract when you direct a Netflix film, I really don't know. Like, are you going to bring the magic? Yes, I will. Are you going to allow me to bring the magic? Probably not. Possibly not. You know, you just don't. It's not guaranteed that you're going to be allowed to use the methods that you usually use as a director once you get involved with like big studios or big money or any of that kind of thing.
And it's interesting to hear you talk about performance as an actor yourself as well. I'm wondering, because rereading the book and even just the whole book itself, so much of it is about the performances, about these actresses playing these unhinged roles. And I'm wondering if, you know, when after you read it, kind of if it changed your outlook on your own performances as well.
I mean, I think it consolidated a lot of things that I felt. I did a screening a while ago with a filmmaker called Kate Hardy, and we screened Fatal Attraction, and I kind of did my defense of Fatal Attraction because I'd read a lot about it, and I was like, what people, when they revisit this film, they see a lot of sexist stereotypes and archetypes that are even created by that film, you know, bunny
100%.
You know, sort of misogynistic tag. But I think revisiting that film, I was a bit like, people are completely negating Glenn Close's creative input into that film. So to sort of write off these films as being sexist, you're actually undermining female creatives' input into that project, which was few and far between in those days. You know, how many female producers, how many female, now you have like a Reese Witherspoon who's, you know, multi-hyphenate all over it, you know, but someone like Glenn Close didn't have the power to be a co-producer. She had to sort of struggle to get her viewpoint about the character and to fight for that role. And to me, I'm like, well, she won, you know, she got the Oscar nomination. Who do you remember from that film? It's her, you know. And I think that really tallied when I read The House of Psychotic Women. And obviously as an actor, I kind of feel that as well. That I'm like, how many times has my contribution to something been overlooked, even though I'm contributing creatively? But everyone's assumed that, oh, you're just a puppet, like you just did what you were told. And I'm like, I didn't actually. I really fought for that. That moment that everyone's saying is great, that person didn't want to do it, and I insisted. So do you know what I mean? Like,
Yes.
And I think there's more of those stories in the 60s and 70s, of course, and 80s, so I think it kind of gives a bit of a reward that has been, unchampioned, those performances. We know they're good, but we tend to think of those women as somehow just victimized because they're playing victims often. But actually, no, they're sort of owning the screen, and they're owning it, they become the winners from being the victim on screen. To me, they're the victor in terms of what I take away from watching that movie. So I think definitely that it's sort of helped me to realize how, it's okay to think these actresses are fantastic actresses. We don't have to think of them as being like, oh, the poor things. This is what they could do.
I love that you bring up Glenn Close, because there's also a thing that, a lot of the performances, I don't know if this is just my thinking, but I feel like a lot of the male over the top performances, as in like, the ones where, they fly into rages, or they have these big over dramatic scenes. I'm thinking of Leo DiCaprio kind of, spit raging all over the screen, or kind of Jack Nicholson having an outburst. Like those performances become canonized. And then you get something like Glenn Close in Fatal Attraction, which is such a brilliant performance. There's so much going on the margins, as well as right there at the center. And I mean, that film in particular is very special because it became this huge cultural phenomenon. But I feel like a lot of the performances that Kayla talks about in the book are kind of thrown aside, be like, oh, she's overacting, or it's too much, or it's kind of too unhinged. But I'm like, you would glamorize the equivalent if it was performed by a man. And like, seriously, and you can see that over and over again. And if it's a genre film, then even more so. It's like, well, it's not acting because it's horror. You just have to show up and be stabbed or something.
Yeah, no, it's not fair, really, is it? I think the inverse sometimes happens as well. That sometimes, like, you have someone like Clint Eastwood doing like literally nothing, like raising an eyebrow, and they're like, oh, he's amazing. And like, you get a woman on screen and they're like, you're not doing enough, you're not doing anything. It's like women it's almost taken for granted that you're going to be like, I call it like an emotional geezer, that you're just going to like that, like, come on, well, the waterworks, the faces, the crying. I mean, I love that as much as the next person, and God, my new film, I am doing a lot of that. I'm like doing it all over the place. But sometimes I'm not doing so much, and people are like, well, you're not doing anything, you're not emoting. It's almost like, maybe it's quite a male perspective as a viewer, that like, well, her face is just nothing, so I can't feel anything that she's feeling, like. And you're like, God, you're really incapable of reading into a woman's feelings unless she's literally screaming at you. But maybe that is reality, that that's the horror of life, isn't it? That unless you scream at someone saying, I'm not happy, no one's going to read into your face. Like, no one's going to take the time to wonder if you're okay and do a close-up on you like Clint Eastwood to work out what the tiny twitch on his face, what could it possibly mean? What is he feeling? Like, do people take the time to do it with women? Maybe not. They're like, and that is the, what causes horror. And, I was talking about like the yellow wallpaper and stuff with Taylor in the conversation, like, most women in history, they're not mad. They're just reacting to impossible circumstances and just unendurable, situations that they're in. And of course they go mad, in inverted commas, because they're just like, there's no other possibility open to them. Like, they're trapped, completely trapped.
So what do you think of when you think of a psychotic woman in films?
In films, I mean, probably Carrie springs to mind. I mean, psychotic is a word that I don't think I fully really know what the meaning of it is. I could look up the meaning, but I think psychotic, when is used quite lazily, isn't it? It's quite bandied around to mean just anyone who's acting a bit oddly.
It's crazy, it's mad woman, unhinged. There's so many variations of it. They all come back to the same thing though, don't they?
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about I love to talk about Greek tragedy in relation to horror and stuff, because I do think that it's sort of like, in Greek tragedy, those women were thought of as having something wrong with them. Definitely, they wouldn't have been described as being mad or psychotic, but they were definitely warnings to the public, like, don't behave like this woman, isn't she awful? And don't behave like this woman, isn't she awful? But at the same time, there's still a sort of grandeur to those roles. They sort of say, well, of course she killed her children because she was put in this situation. It's almost like there's something fated to it. And we don't have that same sort of we have a different understanding now of psychology. So we think, no, there must have been something pathological going on for this person to do this, or we medicalize it now. But in the past, it would just be like, oh, some shit happened and she took revenge. She just did this thing because of course she did, because she's Medea. That's her story. That's her story. Does that. And it's not like, God, she's a crazy woman. It's just like, ooh, she shouldn't have done that. But I love those sort of comparisons because I feel like horror films can have that power to elevate in a similar way, where it's sort of like, this person's doing something that is unacceptable. But we kind of appreciate their expression of their will, I suppose, which they don't get to otherwise enact as a female. So it's a kind of wish fulfillment thing.
Yeah, and sometimes also in a very extreme way, right? Because if you're, and I think this applies to other people, not just women, anyone who feels, I think, kind of stifled, or like the things that they want are unacceptable or forbidden, or sort of even, they should just put them out of their heads completely. Like they shouldn't even be thinking about wanting those things. Horror, I feel, has always had a way to visualize that. And sometimes in like in very different ways, either through kind of comedy horror or through body horror, through hauntings and ghost stories, through, all these different variations. But a lot of them are just like, I just want this thing so badly that I'm gonna transform it into this creature or this like outrageous body horror or like monstrosity, because I can't deal with the implications of wanting this thing in real life.
Yeah. And all of those sort of metaphors are really helpful and useful, and they're very fairy tale as well. Like many of my favorite horrors, when I sort of pull them apart, I'm like, oh, it's fairy tale. It's actually a really old story. It's a really old fairy tale. And again, you could say fairy tales are warnings, and they're about punishing women in some ways, of like, don't do this bad thing, or this bad thing will happen to you and it's your fault. But you can also see it as really cathartic, and sort of there's a sort of solidarity, or like a comforting aspect of like, this was happening to women in the past back then, and it's still a danger, and this is a safe way of learning about it, or a safe way of dealing with it. I recently sort of would love to write an essay about this, that like Silence the Lambs is Bluebeard, basically. And like the way that she goes into his lair, and this sort of idea of like, because in some versions of Bluebeard, she stays married to him, basically. She sort of finds a way of solving the riddle that he's killed lots of women, and being okay with it. And it's just okay as long as she survives. And there's like, Arabian Nights is similar, like he's killed all of his ex-wives and she still wants to be with him, and the way that she does it is by telling him a story, and like that means he lets her live, and she's like, oh great, I'll stay married to him then. And you're like, what? But it's that kind of fascination about being in the beast's lair and then staying in the lair, like not leaving it, just like marrying the beast, basically.
I mean,
Um,
I would love to read that essay, Alice. You actually made
that's
me
probably
think.
it. That's probably I like have one idea and like, yeah, that's it. There's no essay.
And I wanted to ask you, kind of going back to House of Psychotic Women, your own film is included in the new expanded edition, Revenge.
Is I'm honored to say that it is. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you feel about it? And that how do you feel about, Prevention came out in 2016, if I remember correctly. How do you feel about the film being in this new canon that Kayla created, and also about that character with a few years gone by now?
I mean, it is really weird when I think about my journey with that book and
Mm.
then the fact that I'm in it. It's like it's like one of those really strange things. I've got the new edition on my shelf actually. I mean, it's amazing. It's great. I think yeah, I think it's great that there's loads of female directors in there now because there has
Mhm.
been this sort of explosion of female horror. Like I'm really flattered to be in the book with those other filmmakers as well. Yeah, I mean I'm just really proud of the film. I think in a hopefully healthy way, I've kind of moved on to the next project in my head. So to me,
Mhm.
it's like revisiting old coursework or something from or an old exam that I did. That makes it sound really awful, but I am really proud of the film, but I'm kind of so moved on from it in my head, and it was so inextricably connected to having a baby and stuff. And
Mm.
then after that I started trying to make another film, and then I got pregnant with another baby, and then the lockdown happened, and it just feels like, to me it felt like, I mean, I think most female directors go through this, that you really just want your second film to happen quickly, and it doesn't happen quickly. It's sort of proven that female directors, oh dear, the female directors have a much bigger gap between their first and second film, and
Mhm.
loads of female directors never get to make another film, even if
Yeah.
they have a successful first film. So like the anxiety that sort of went with that, and kind of actually turning down a lot of projects. It wasn't that I wasn't being offered to direct other
Mhm.
things. It was just more that I'd got two young children and I just really didn't want to be away from them unless I had a really, really good reason to be away
Yeah.
from them. So I really just wanted to pursue my own projects that I felt passionate about, and
Mhm.
not that was just like a money gig or a sort of, I mean, meanwhile, I was earning money by doing lots of writing and keeping the wolf from the door in that way. Yeah, so my daughter's here with me now, so it's like perfect timing for talking about parenthood. But I think I very much sort of want to prove that I can make films that are not just about parenthood. For a
Mhm.
while, I got offered loads and loads of stuff, which was just kind of more of the same. Like, do
Mhm.
you make a horror about a baby? No, I've literally just made a horror about a baby. Oh, right, okay. It's like people's imagination doesn't expand to, you know, you making stuff, other stuff. And you do get offered opportunities as a female director, but quite often it'll be like very specific. You're like, what? You only get offered things about women,
Yeah.
basically, very specifically. Yeah, I feel like I'm really, really proud of that film, and I
Mm.
really sort of outside of me now. It's become something beyond me. It's something other than me. It's like another
Mm.
person. That film. I knew that it would be something that not many women had directed while pregnant, and certainly not starred and directed while pregnant. And that sort of, I hoped that that would be a significant thing,
Mm.
and I feel like because it is now in texts and books and stuff, that it is like, it's sort of, I feel like it's been recognized as a sort of an important thing for female
Mm.
filmmakers, or a key sort of moment. So yeah, every time you're included in a publication or something, it's like a bit of, oh yeah, okay. And again, we didn't like win loads of awards or anything. We won a couple, but you know, often sometimes critically, you're more recognized sort of academically for your work than you are actually in
Yeah.
terms of awards and stuff. It's really weird because like I'm too long in the tooth to really care about awards really now, but they do make making other things easier. That's the annoying thing about it. You're like, oh yeah, you kind of just get a bit of a easier time for a short time to get stuff made.
Well, it's two different industries, isn't it? It's the people who are just looking at the film for the film's sakes, and the people who are looking at the film to see if it makes money, if they can cast someone from the film in the next thing, if they want to hire someone else who's been working on it, like the actual industry side that is making the work, not looking at it.
Yeah, and not looking at a bigger picture of what is actually happening culturally. But again, it's like what we were talking about. It's like is sort of, I mean, I think I've always been interested in people who don't play that game as well. It's like, very early on, I really loved the work of like Shane Meadows and Paddy Considine, and the fact they were just going out and making stuff. I was like, that totally inspired me. But they didn't, you look back on what awards they've had, they really have not really won BAFTAs or anything. Like they just are culturally important without being sort of recognized as such. It's like,
or being recognized a lot later on in their career. With all of the guests for this miniseries, I've been offering them to pick a film that's featured in Kayla's book. And you had a number of great suggestions, but we landed on Heavenly Creatures. Can you talk a little bit about why you picked that specific film?
I think it's really hard to categorize as a film. And I think it also gets overlooked quite a bit because of Peter Jackson's other work. And for me, it was very mind-blowing seeing that film. I saw it at such a formative stage in my life where I don't think I'd seen many films about female friendships for a start, where there's two female protagonists. And I also hadn't really seen many films about the female imagination, I think. It's like this really unusual territory where I feel like you get a lot of films about male artists or male fantasists or whatever, but you don't get many female characters that are about the interior. Female characters usually about the exterior. It's about their boyfriend or their children or their job or something like that. And I felt like that was mind-blowing to me, to see characters that were very much had built their own world from their own mind. And I really identified with that. There's not that many films which have that as a sort of subject matter. And actually, weirdly, it's sort of the context of my next film as well. So, it had a real impact on me.
And this is a really interesting part of that you mentioned, and of kind of the film, which, not to sound very basic this early in the morning, but is fundamentally visual. So it's very difficult to present the things that are going on inside the characters. How would you describe the interior world, also the shared interior world that Juliet and Pauline have in the film?
I think what's really surprising when you return to the film is how many different sort of mixed media and strange things happen in the film. Because when I revisited it, I was like, oh my God, I've forgotten this whole section which is sort of black and white, and Orson Welles is chasing them, and there's all this sort of is it Orson Welles? I think it is Orson Welles. It's the actor from The Third Man, anyway.
Yeah, it's Orson Welles.
So he's pursuing them, and then there's all the stuff with the sort of claymation, which is how they create their fantasy world that they've invented. And then there's sort of use of CGI as well, which is sort of actually pretty restrained and pretty well done for the time, which I suppose is a bit of a precursor to the brilliance of Lord of the Rings and stuff, and how restrained it is, and how it's all a cohesive work of art, which makes you feel like it's a singular perspective, or I suppose it's two people's perspective. And I think that's really, really well done, but also really tricky, because you could categorize the film as horror, I suppose, loosely, because there's a killing in it. But really it's fantasy. It's just very, very dark fantasy. And I love fantasy films, and I feel like there was a real trend towards fantasy in the 80s, which is what I grew up with, you know, Dark Crystal and Legend, and really those were my favorite films growing up. All these kind of fairy tale films. And I feel like more it's probably almost belongs to that category, but it's sort of about the dangers of fantasy, which I think is really fascinating to me as someone who is a bit of a fantasist. It's sort of about what happens if you become too immersed in fantasy, and then that becomes horror. Fantasy becomes horror if you allow it to overtake your real life, or that's the kind of message.
Do you feel like it's a cautionary tale in a while of too intense friendships or too a wide imagination?
I guess so, but I think it's very forgiving to the protagonists. It's very I don't think it's sort of like cautionary in the sense of like, let this be a warning to not let your teenage daughters read too much. I think it's more a sort of, to me, it was it sort of made you realize how girls in that era might have been led to this particular sort of scenario. I mean, it's a folie à deux, basically, which I'm really fascinated by. That was a lot of the research that we did for Sightseers, for example, which is the film I did 10 years ago about a couple who are serial killers. We did a lot of research about folie à deux, which is like two people doing actions they would not have otherwise done had they not met. So I think it definitely belongs to that category for these two girls. Would they have done what they did? And certainly it seems like from their lives afterwards, because it's a true life story, from their lives afterwards, they didn't go on to kill people. They didn't carry on. You know, they had very lenient sentences because they were so young. And really, you sort of go, this was a situation, a sort of freak situation that occurred because of these fantasy worlds they built, because of the combination of their personalities, and because of the particular situation or place that they found themselves in. You know, that they're not sure whether there was a romantic relationship. They sort of touch upon it slightly in the film. And, you know, there was all sorts of condemnation of homosexuality in that era. So you kind of wonder how much the repression and the lifestyle that these girls were living sort of created a kind of madness, a temporary madness within them. So I think the film is very I don't think you come away from that film hating those girls. You kind of really feel for them.
Yeah, and I think for any girl or young woman or anyone really who has to, either because of whatever the circumstances of their life is, or just because that's the way that they're built, lives in their head a lot and spends a lot of time in their imagination. It's such a powerful kind of it feels very visceral. Like every time I've seen it, and I was a kid with a very vivid imagination who read a lot of like fantasy and horror stuff and wrote a lot from a very early age. So this creating your own world because the world that you exist in is just not enough is so vivid in the film. And then the other thing that I wanted to ask you about that really always stuck with me about this film, and it's extreme because they end up committing a murder, but they kind of do it to protect their friendship. And this intensity of this very like teenage girl friendship, this, extreme BFFs. What did you make of their friendship to each other, which feels to them in that moment in the film almost like life-saving, or, like something they need in order to exist?
I think that's really interesting, in the sense that they are defending this world that they've built. They've definitely, and the way that it's shot, everything, it's a very colourful film. There's lots of light in it, for something that's a very dark subject matter. And it is like all these beautiful dreams they've created are going to be shattered by, they think, their parents, and in particular, one of their mothers. And I think I mean, I also think there is a power imbalance in their relationship, which I found really fascinating as well, like the struggle that they have. Because certainly when I was like a teenager, I would have a best friend that would be like better looking than me. And I would just have to accept that. And I'd accept that I was the kind of beta female in the scenario, that she was like main character and I was just the sidekick. And you know, everyone would fancy her and she would have all the sort of romantic intrigue and I'd just be there sort of spectating and advising. And I think a lot of young women identify with that as well. It's not necessarily that healthy a relationship. There's another film as well, which I think is fantastic. And I sort of align the two, which is Me Without You.
Oh, I love it. The Sandra Goldbacher film.
Yeah, it's a brilliant film. And again, it's completely overlooked. And I remember seeing that and just going, well, this is me. This is, I just identify with this so much. And it's an untold story because nobody has bothered to think that a teenage girl's fairly uneventful life is that special to tell this story. But it spans, you know, a teenage friendship through to adulthood and the sort of unhealthy codependency between these two women. And it's kind of this thing of, you know, one girl is very dominant, but the reason she's so dominant is because of her own weaknesses within herself that she's perfectly aware of, but her friend just thinks she's, you know, the dog's proverbials, and she thinks, you know, you're in charge because you should be, because you're the best. And it takes her until adulthood before she realizes that was wrong, that was unhealthy, this person was pretty toxic in my life. And I think there's some element of that to Heavenly Creatures, that there was definitely a sort of a worshipping scenario going on where, you know, I read about the real life case as well, that one of the girls was English. And so she was very exotic to everybody and she'd got an English accent, and that was very entrancing and probably in a way presented a kind of fantasy aspect as well, that you meet someone that is sort of feels out of your reality because they talk like a princess, or you know, they talk like you think a certain character might talk in a book that you've read about the Queen or something, you know, and that also helps to kind of build this unreality. I mean, I also think that then when the murder occurs in the film, it is one of the most shocking murders that I've ever seen in a film. Really? And I still find it really shocking when I watch it, because there's something about the reality of it, and it's done in very real time, that you feel like you're there and you feel like you know that person, and it's so transgressive what they've done, and you feel really like, oh no, this is a mistake. What have they done? Like, and it really did make me feel sick, like the whole thing.
It's also such a visual departure from the rest of the film, which is so, you know, like you mentioned, so visually inventive, so colorful, so in their heads and inside their fantasy lives that they build for themselves, that when the murder actually happens, it really takes you out of it, because it's like, no, this is real. This is not their fantasy murder. This is what they're actually doing. And it's stark, and it's the sound of it. I still remember the sound.
Yes, I remember the sound. It's the sound. Yes, me too.
All of those things.
I actually remember that scene so vividly. It's like I could replay it in my head. It's like, it's so visceral, and it's so sort of pedestrian, which I think is probably a lot of people's experience of like an accident or violence or anything like that, is when you think back to it, is how banal it is actually, that it was mainly about, you know, very small details that led up to, you know, to me it's when she's looking at that jewel and she starts talking to them about it, and it's so pathetic and sort of heartrending that she wants them to come and look at this thing, and they've planted it there to make her look at it, and you just feel so sorry for the mother, and she's just so real to you. You're just like, she's a real person doing real things, having real reactions, and you just pity her so much. And that moment is so well done and works, I think, because of the way they set up the fantasy throughout the whole film, that suddenly reality crashes in. And I just think that's so cleverly done, that division. And again, like, I would say my new film is very much about that. I'm in the edit now, and it's sort of like, oh, reality crashes in at this point. And it is shocking, and it's a violent wrench when it happens, you know, for the character and for the audience, hopefully. And I think that split is really fascinating to me. I think a lot of the work that I've done is about wanting fantasy to be real, but unfortunately reality dominates in the end. Reality wins out. And I'm just kind of continually fascinated by that split.
And you know, you mentioned a little bit about them before, but what do you make of Kate Winslet and Melanie Linsky's performance? Because they were also, I think, roughly the same age as the characters they were playing, weren't they were teenage girls when they were doing the movie. What do you make of their performance? Because it demands so much of them.
I mean, just incredible. I think you kind of knew that they were both going to be stars, but I've got a massive acting crush on Melanie Linsky. Like I always have had. Like I was so delighted to see her in loads of TV shows recently and films, because I think she's amazing. And for me, I mean, I think it's a bit like My Summer of Love. I remember watching that, which also I think is a fantastic film, and knowing that Emily Blunt was going to get snapped up by Hollywood immediately, and not really understanding why that didn't happen for the other actress. And I think it was the same with Heavenly Creatures. I was a bit like, you know, obviously Kate Winslet, we all know what happened. She ended up in Titanic and the rest is history. But for Melanie Linsky, that journey was different. And, you know, I'm sure she was working continually, but she was not on my radar personally. And you know, for me, her performance as this kind of disenfranchised girl, I was just so fascinated by her. I've not seen many performances like that. Again, like maybe something like Welcome to the Doll's House. For me, I was like, I identify with this character so much. This, you know, to be a young girl when you're not, nobody is telling you that you're pretty and you don't feel pretty and you don't know what your power is supposed to be. You haven't found your power because you're told that being pretty is the most important thing, especially in that era. And for her to kind of find this other way to explore her willpower and her brain and you know, find a happiness for herself in a different way. To me, I just identify with that so much. And I just think she did that. Yeah, I just think it's an amazing performance.
It's yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned Welcome to the Dollhouse, because there is, and you know, this film from the 94, I think, from memory, and there is this moment, I think, in 90s cinema where there's quite a few of these sort of weird, disenfranchised, especially teenage girls, whether that's supernatural, like in The Craft, or, you know, or more
Ghost World or something.
Yes. Or even like something like I'm thinking of Winona Ryder here. I mean, Heathers is late 80s, but still kind of counts. Or even stuff like Reality Bites, and like these beautiful, you know, teenage girls or young women who were just not they would have never been the lead in the movie in the 80s, if that makes sense. And kind of stepping into their world and how they look at the world becomes so transgressive, even though it shouldn't be. It's just real life, or, you know, we're in their heads. But it's such a, I think, kind of this moment in film history really started to pay attention to them versus to the tall blonde kind of leading ladies of the previous decade. But I did kind of want to ask you as well, you know, you mentioned at the start that this film might be a little bit obscured by the rest of Peter Jackson's filmography, which I think is true. You know, when you make juggernauts like Lord of the Rings, it's difficult not to have everything else kind of become curios. But what do you think?
It's quite anomalous as well with his work.
Yeah.
And I think people, again, it's this typical thing which I talk about a lot, which is overlooking female contribution. That, of course, like Fran Walsh wrote the screenplay with him, and I just think her mark is all over it, I'm sure. Like, but it's really hard to disentangle her contribution from his. So again, And I feel like, to me, I'm like, she probably pursued that story. Like, she was the person that was like, oh, I'm fascinated by this. Oh, I've read about it in the paper. Oh my God, I've been obsessed with this for years, but you don't get interviews, as many interviews with her. They are some out there, but to me, it's so, when you think about how many, I mean, partly it's Tolkien's fault, but there's hardly any female characters in Lord of the Rings, as we know. And for him to have these two female characters, it just comes out of left field. You're like, they're so powerful and so well-rounded as characters. That I feel like I'd love to see her being interviewed about it and talk about it. I'm sure there are interviews out there, but I feel like her contribution to it probably gets overlooked.
And what do you think is sort of the legacy of the film? Can you see its fingerprints on any other films that you've seen recently?
I don't know, actually. I mean, I know that people do talk about it in very, very hallowed terms in the film world now. I think people do recognize it as a classic. But I don't know how many people really tell female friendships in a really convincing way, or how many people really focus upon that as a kind of, oh yeah, that's gonna sell. I don't know. To me, it's when people make teen stuff, they tend to make about groups of teens, don't they? Especially horror, it's sort of like a group of teens. And I love that intimacy of that kind of one-on-one obsessive relationship, because really it is the folie à deux thing that I was talking about. That is when people enter into really strange territory, because when you've got a group of people, there's going to be one person going, no, I don't want to do that because it's too weird, or this is not my bag, I don't, and there'll be a split, or there'll be like a schism, or there'll be people, it's just laws of averages, isn't it? If you've got 5 people, their behavior is not going to go to that extreme generally, unless it's the Manson cult or something. That's a whole other thing. And so I kind of feel like that one-on-one friendship element, maybe it's the internet or something, has kind of destroyed that, because now we have a whole audience of people telling us what's wrong or right. Generally, don't we? Like, if they'd had the internet, those girls, would they have done what they did? Like,
oh, I think they probably would have. I think what's really interesting,
maybe they would have done it on a bigger scale.
Maybe maybe they would have just
ambitious.
Yeah, or hacked the mum and done something with her like finances, or ruin her life in an even more permanent way.
Yeah, exactly. But I do think that I haven't seen as much about those kind of intimate friendships, because I do think there is a sense of like, well, I think solitude is a bigger thing. There's people, teenagers, it more seems to be solitude plus the internet. Like, I think that isolation that you have as a teenager, in the past you would find a friend if you were lucky, or I disappeared into books. Really, I would like sit in my bedroom and draw and listen to records. That's what I would do, and that was how I kind of built my fantasy world in my head. That I didn't, I had best friends and stuff, but they weren't as probably obsessive and weird as me, but but yeah, I don't know if there's the same space for films about obsessive friendships. I haven't seen many.
I'd like to see a new one. I've seen a lot more films about sort of parasocial obsessive friendships, like Ingrid Goes West and things like that, because of the internet, because it just gives us room for women obsessing with other women kind of platonically. But
I must see that. That's good.
It's really good, but it's very much about, influencer culture and developing a relationship that is one-sided with someone on the internet. But this, this folie à deux, this pulling at each other all the time and pushing each other onwards, even if it means doing bad things, it's a very different type of dynamic than when you're following a leader, like in a cult or a group. There's always someone who's the leader.
Yeah.
and people who
And I
follow.
guess as well on the internet, it's like you can find a weirdo that is like you. They might live in another country or another state or another, town or city or something, but you can find them.
Yes.
And
And you
that's the
can develop
danger, actually. There's more opportunities for the kind of creating that madness, and that, I guess that's what incels and stuff is about, is you're finding other groups of other people that have the same extreme beliefs, and you can push the extreme beliefs even further and create new. I suppose that is really what a lot of conspiracy theorists and stuff, they're building fantasy worlds for themselves. They're just
building a
not quite
fantasy
as
future.
charming and sweet as like the Heavenly Creatures sort of worlds, where it was very childish what they were doing, really, wasn't it? It was sort of scraps of their culture, which would be probably quite tenuous and quite small, books, couple of films that they would go to see at the movies. And that's what I found as a teenager as well, that really what you were interested in was a real excavation job, or you would re-listen to things over and over again because you couldn't afford many records. You would revisit stuff over and over and over. And I was talking the other day to like my friend that my best friend from childhood, that if we fancied someone, you couldn't stalk them on Facebook. You would have to draw a picture of them. Like we literally used to do that. Like we would hand draw. We'd go, oh, this guy, oh, he's, we'd seen him, but we'd never taken a photo of him. We didn't know him well enough. And so we would sit and draw pictures, like literally by candlelight, like witches, like medieval witches. We would just sit there with a biro, one sort of lined paper homework book. You draw a picture of this guy, and that would be it. That would be your totem that you could re-look at, is a hand drawing that you'd done of this person, which just seems so ancient and Jane Austen style. But that was the only way. So it was just like any of your fantasies were just so hand built, I suppose. And I think that was what's great about the claymation. There's this really disturbing animation which is called The Adventures of Mark Twain. And it's on YouTube, and there's this bit where these children are tempted by the devil, and it's done with claymation. And I wonder how influenced, whenever I see Heavenly Creatures, and I see, it's called Barovnia or something, their fantasy world, and it's all clay people. And I always wonder how much it might have been influenced by this Adventures of Mark Twain, because it really is quite similar. And it's the way the characters sort of crumble and then reassemble as other things, and fight battles and stuff. And it's about the weakness of humanity. It's sort of like how easily shaped people are by influences, which I think is a really powerful idea, that the devil can just shape you into doing what he wants you to do. And I think that's what's fascinating about these clay people in Heavenly Creatures. It's like they've made these people, they're influencing them, they have such power over they can rip them apart, they could just destroy them in a second. And I just think that's such a brilliant blend of like childhood, but also sort of terrifying as well. Children that are terrifying, that want to
I'm very into children's animations that's actually secretly or not so secretly terrifying, or full-on horror movies. But Alice, I'm conscious that you have to go back into the edit, so I'm gonna let you go. But thank you so much for your time and for your insight on Heavenly Creatures and House of Psychotic Women as well.
Oh, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. It's been really fun to revisit the film and the book.
Good. I'm glad.
Amazing.